The morning sun had barely peeked over the Philadelphia skyline as Agent Wilson made his way toward the FBI field office. It was just another Monday, or so he thought. The seasoned agent had chosen casual attire today, a dark blue polo and khaki pants, preparing for an undercover operation scheduled later that afternoon. After 15 years on the force, he'd learned that blending in was an art form. The side entrance of the building was his usual route, quieter and more convenient than the main doors where tourists often lingered, hoping to snap photos of federal agents. As he approached the familiar gray door, fishing his keycard from his pocket, a sharp voice cut through the morning air. "Hey, stop right there." Agent Wilson turned to see an unfamiliar security officer rushing toward him, hand raised in a stopping motion. The officer was new. Wilson had never seen him before, but that wasn't unusual with the recent staff changes. "Good morning," Wilson said calmly, reaching for his FBI credentials. "I'm just heading in for—" "I said stop," the officer interrupted, his voice carrying an edge that made several passing employees pause. "This entrance is restricted. You need to use the main entrance like everyone else." Wilson could feel eyes on them now. A small group of early morning workers had slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the familiar sting of what was happening, but he kept his voice steady and professional. "Officer, I understand your concern, but I'm an FBI agent. Let me just show you my credentials." He reached slowly toward his back pocket. "Don't move." The officer's hand shifted to his holster and his face hardened. "Step back from the door and keep your hands where I can see them." The morning air suddenly felt thick with tension. Wilson could hear whispers from the growing crowd of onlookers. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the frustration of a situation he'd faced too many times before, just never at his own workplace. "Listen," Wilson said, his voice remaining remarkably composed despite the circumstances. "I've been working in this building for 15 years. I'm reaching for my FBI badge. You can verify." The officer cut him off again, this time reaching for his radio. "I need backup at the side entrance," he barked into the device. Got an uncooperative individual attempting to access the restricted area. More employees had gathered now, some recording with their phones, others watching with concerned expressions. Wilson stood perfectly still, his hands visible, dignity intact despite the humiliation of being profiled at the very building where he'd solved countless cases and earned numerous commendations. A car door slammed nearby, and quick footsteps approached. The deputy director of the field office, a veteran agent who'd worked with Wilson on numerous high-profile cases, emerged from the morning crowd. Her presence commanded immediate attention, her badge glinting in the early sunlight. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, her tone sharp and authoritative. She looked between Wilson and the security officer, though she clearly knew exactly what was unfolding before her. The security officer straightened his posture, still keeping one hand near his weapon. "Ma'am, this individual was attempting to access the restricted entrance. I was just—" "This individual," she interrupted, her voice cutting through the morning air like a knife, "is Special Agent Wilson, one of our most decorated undercover operatives. He's been with this office longer than most people here, including myself." The story continues with the revelation of Wilson's true identity having immediate repercussions, but this first part sets up the tension and conflict while maintaining a natural, engaging narrative flow that keeps readers invested in what happens next. The security officer's face drained of color as the deputy director's words hung in the air. His hand slowly dropped from his holster, but the damage was already done. The morning crowd had grown larger, with agents and staff members clustering around the entrance, their expressions a mix of concern and disapproval. I was just following protocol," the officer stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. "He wasn't using the main entrance, and I thought—" "You thought what exactly?" The deputy director's question cut through his explanation like a razor. She turned to Agent Wilson, who maintained his professional composure despite the situation. "Agent, I apologize for this unfortunate incident." Wilson nodded, finally able to reach for his credentials without fear of escalation. He pulled out his FBI badge, its gold shield gleaming in the morning light. "No harm done," he said, though everyone present could feel the weight of those words. The officer was doing his job, perhaps just a bit too enthusiastically. The gathered crowd started murmuring among themselves. Several senior agents who knew Wilson's reputation were shaking their heads in disbelief. A Youngington was still recording everything on her phone, though his supervisor quietly asked her to stop. The security officer, now visibly sweating, tried to regain some professional ground. "Sir, I sincerely apologize. If I had known you were an agent." "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Wilson's voice remained calm, but his words carried weight. "You shouldn't need to know someone's rank to treat them with basic respect and dignity. I could have been anyone, a consultant, a witness, or yes, even an FBI agent. The color of my skin shouldn't determine how you approach your duties." The morning sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the gathering. More employees were arriving for the day shift, forced to navigate around the crowd that had formed. The story of what happened was already spreading through whispered conversations and quick glances. "Officer," the deputy director spoke again, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Please report to my office in 1 hour. We need to discuss proper procedural conduct and the implications of what just happened here." She turned to address the growing crowd. "The rest of you, I believe you have work to do." As people began to disperse, many approached Wilson with supportive gestures, a pat on the shoulder, a quiet word of encouragement, or simply a knowing look. He'd earned their respect over years of dedicated service, and seeing him treated this way in his own workplace struck a chord with many. The security officer remained rooted to his spot, the realization of his actions seemingly hitting him in waves. His earlier bravado had completely disappeared, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that his assumptions had nearly caused a serious incident with a highly respected federal agent. Wilson adjusted his polo shirt and took out his keycard again. This time, no one stopped him as he approached the door. He turned to the officer, who looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. "You know what the irony is?" Wilson said, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "I'm heading out on an undercover operation later today. My job is to blend in, to make people see what they expect to see. But I never thought I'd have to prove myself in my own office." As he swiped his card and opened the door, Wilson paused. The security officer, still standing there, looked up expectantly, perhaps waiting for more harsh words or criticism. Instead, Wilson simply said, "Let's make this a learning moment. Not just for you, but for everyone who thinks they can judge a person's worth by their appearance." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving behind a changed atmosphere in the morning air. The security officer stood there, badge gleaming in the sunlight, faced with the consequences of his actions and the realization that his morning's routine security check had revealed far more about himself than about the agent he tried to stop. Inside the building, word of the incident was already racing through the offices faster than any official memo could travel. Agents and staff members who'd witnessed the scene were recounting it to their colleagues, each adding another layer to the story of how one of their most respected undercover agents had faced discrimination at his own workplace. The morning was far from over, and this incident would spark discussions, changes, and reflections that would ripple through the entire field office. But for now, Agent Wilson walked through the familiar hallways, greeting colleagues as he always did, carrying himself with the same dignity and professionalism that had earned him his reputation, refusing to let one officer's prejudice define his day or his career. The deputy director watched through her office window as the morning unfolded into chaos. She'd been with the Bureau for 20 years, but some mornings still managed to surprise her. Today was definitely one of those mornings. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since she'd stepped in to defuse the situation at the side entrance. News traveled fast in a federal building, and this particular story had wings. She'd already received calls from 3 different department heads, 2 supervisory agents, and the regional director's office. Taking a sip from her now-cold coffee, she watched agents and staff members gathered in small clusters throughout the office, no doubt discussing what they'd witnessed or heard about. The morning's incident had struck a nerve, especially among the minority agents who'd experienced similar situations outside these walls. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, though she already knew who it would be. The security officer from earlier entered, looking considerably less confident than he had during the morning confrontation. His uniform was still crisp and neat, but his posture showed the weight of his actions. "Ma'am," he began, standing at attention, "reporting as ordered." "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "We need to have a serious conversation about what happened this morning." The officer sank into the chair, his eyes fixed on the desk between them. "Yes, ma'am. I understand, and I want to apologize." She held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Before you continue, I want you to understand something. Agent Wilson isn't just any agent. He's led some of our most successful undercover operations. He's brought down drug cartels, exposed corruption rings, and saved countless lives. Last year, he received a commendation from the director himself." The officer's face fell further with each achievement she listed. "I had no idea." "That's exactly the point," she interrupted again. "You had no idea who he was, but you made immediate assumptions based on his appearance. Tell me, if he'd been wearing a suit, would you have reacted the same way?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Through her open office door, she could hear the usual morning bustle of the office, but it felt different today, charged with an energy that spoke of change coming. "I've reviewed the security footage," she continued, turning her computer monitor so he could see. The screen showed multiple angles of the morning's confrontation. "What I see is an experienced federal agent being treated like a suspicious character at his own workplace. Care to explain your thought process?" The officer watched the footage, seeing his actions from an outside perspective for the first time. His hand moving to his holster, his aggressive stance, the gathering crowd, it all looked very different from this angle. I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my preconceptions cloud my judgment. There's no excuse for that." Just then, another knock came at the door. Agent Wilson stood there, still in his casual attire for his upcoming operation. The officer immediately stood up, but Wilson waved him back down. "Sorry to interrupt," Wilson said, his calm demeanor unchanged from earlier. "But I thought I should be part of this conversation." The deputy director nodded, gesturing for him to enter. Wilson chose to remain standing, leaning against the wall near the window. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the office floor. "You know," Wilson began, addressing the officer directly, "I've been on both sides of situations like this. As an undercover agent, I've had to deal with people's assumptions and prejudices. Sometimes those assumptions help my cover. Other times," he paused, letting his words sink in, "other times they remind me that we still have a long way to go." The office fell silent except for the distant ringing of phones and the hum of conversation beyond the door. The security officer seemed to shrink further into his chair with each passing moment. "I'm not here to demand your badge or call for your termination," Wilson continued. "That wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I want to know what you learned from this morning." The officer looked up, surprise evident on his face. He'd clearly expected a much different reaction. "I learned that I need to check my biases," he said slowly. "That I can't just act on assumptions. That I need to treat everyone with the same level of respect and professionalism, regardless of how they look." The deputy director watched this exchange with interest. She'd known Wilson long enough to trust his judgment, and she could see what he was doing, turning a potentially explosive situation into a teaching moment. "Good," Wilson nodded. "That's a start. But here's what I really want you to understand. This morning wasn't just about me. It was about every person who's ever been judged unfairly based on their appearance. In our line of work, that kind of judgment isn't just unprofessional, it's dangerous." Through the window, they could see more agents arriving for the day shift, unaware of the important conversation happening in the deputy director's office. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows now, as if reflecting the clarity that was emerging from this difficult situation. Word of the morning's incident spread through the FBI building like wildfire. By mid-morning, every floor was buzzing with discussions, and the story had reached the director's office in Washington. Phones kept ringing, emails were flying back and forth, and urgent meetings were being called. The deputy director sat at her desk, looking at her computer screen with a grim expression. She just finished a video call with headquarters, and the gravity of the situation was clear. This wasn't just about one incident anymore, it had become a wake-up call for the entire organization. "The director wants a full report by end of day," she told her assistant, who was taking notes. "And he's particularly interested in Agent Wilson's perspective on this." Meanwhile, in the break room on the third floor, A group of agents had gathered around the coffee machine, speaking in hushed tones. They fell silent as Agent Wilson walked in, but he just smiled and reached for a cup. "Don't stop on my account," he said, pouring himself some coffee. "I think we all need to talk about what happened this morning." One of the younger agents spoke up. "Sir, I saw everything. The way you handled it. I don't think I could have kept my cool like that." Wilson stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "You know what's funny? In all my years undercover, I've faced way worse situations. Drug lords pointing guns at me, corrupt officials threatening my family, criminals questioning my cover story. But somehow, being profiled at my own workplace," he paused, letting the words sink in, "that hits different." The break room grew quieter as more agents filtered in, drawn by the conversation. Every one of them knew Wilson's reputation, the cases he'd cracked, the operations he'd led, the lives he'd saved. Seeing him treated like a suspicious character had shaken many of their assumptions about their own workplace. "You want to know the real irony?" Wilson continued, leaning against the counter. "I was heading in early to prepare for an undercover operation. One where I'll probably face similar prejudices, but use them to my advantage. It's a strange world when the same assumptions that help me catch criminals are the ones I have to fight against in my own office." Just then, the security officer appeared in the doorway, escorted by his supervisor. The room fell silent again, but this time with a different kind of tension. The officer looked like he'd aged 10 years since the morning. "Agent Wilson," the officer said, his voice slightly shaky, "I've just finished my meeting with Internal Affairs. But before anything else happens, I needed to find you and apologize properly. Not because I was ordered to, but because I understand now what I did wrong." Wilson set down his coffee cup and turned to face him. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "This morning," the officer continued, "I wasn't just wrong about you. I was wrong about what it means to do this job. I let my biases override my training, my professionalism, and basic human decency. I saw what I expected to see, not what was actually there." The officer reached into his pocket and pulled out his security badge. "I'm prepared to hand this in. What I did goes against everything this badge stands for." Wilson looked at the badge, then at the officer's face. The room remained completely silent, everyone waiting to see how he would respond. Even the usual office noise seemed muted, as if the building itself was listening. "Keep it," Wilson said finally, "but make it mean something different from now on." The officer looked up, surprised. "Sir? You made a mistake," Wilson continued. "A serious one. But what matters now is what you learned from it. That badge should remind you every day that security isn't just about watching doors and checking IDs. It's about protecting everyone's right to be treated with dignity and respect." As he spoke, Wilson noticed the deputy director standing in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. She gave him a slight nod, acknowledging the wisdom in his approach. "The director's office has been calling all morning," she announced to the room. "They want to know how we're handling this situation. I think I just got my answer." She stepped forward, addressing both Wilson and the officer. "This incident is going to change things around here. We're implementing new training programs, reviewing all our security protocols, and taking a hard look at our institutional biases." And she added, looking directly at Wilson, "We'd like you to be part of that change." The moment felt significant, like a page turning in the office's history. Through the break room windows, the late morning sun illuminated the scene, casting long shadows that seemed to connect everyone in the room, regardless of their rank or role. On the wall, the FBI seal caught the light, its motto clearly visible: fidelity, bravery, integrity. Today, those words were being put to the test in a way nobody had expected during their morning commute. By afternoon, the morning's incident had taken on a life of its own. The FBI director's office had sent an official notice. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Every field office across the country would be watching how Philadelphia handled this situation. The deputy director sat in the conference room, surrounded by department heads and senior agents. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the serious expressions around the table. On the screen at the front of the room, a video feed showed the morning's incident from multiple security cameras. "The footage speaks for itself," one of the department heads said, breaking the heavy silence. "We can't ignore what this reveals about our workplace culture." Another agent leaned forward. "It's not just about this one incident. How many others have gone unreported? How many employees feel they can't speak up? The room buzzed with uncomfortable energy as people shared glances. Everyone knew this conversation was long overdue. Let's talk about immediate actions, the deputy director said, standing up. She walked to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. What changes can we implement right now? Just then, there was a knock at the door. Agent Wilson stood there, still in his casual clothes, but now carrying a thick folder. Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you might want to see this. He placed the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were dozens of emails and messages he'd received since morning, not just from their office, but from agents across the country. Stories of similar experiences, of staying silent, of facing prejudice both inside and outside the bureau. These aren't just complaints, Wilson explained, his voice steady. These are our colleagues reaching out, hoping that what happened this morning might finally lead to real change. The security officer's supervisor spoke up from his corner of the room. We've already started revising our security protocols, but it's clear we need more than just new rules. We need a complete cultural shift. The deputy director nodded, writing on the whiteboard. Immediate actions needed. Under it, she began listing points as people called them out. Comprehensive bias training for all staff. Review of security protocols. Anonymous reporting system. Regular diversity discussions. Mentorship programs. Cultural awareness workshops. These are good starts, Wilson said, but we need to go deeper. This isn't just about preventing incidents, it's about creating an environment where they're unthinkable. He walked to the window, looking out at the city below. You know what struck me most about this morning? It wasn't the officer's actions. It was how many of our colleagues stood there, watching, not sure what to do. That's what we need to change. The room fell silent as his words sank in. On the table, phones continued to buzz with messages from headquarters, each one demanding updates on the situation. One of the senior agents raised her hand. What if we used this as a case study, not to shame anyone, but to learn? To show real examples of how bias affects judgment, how it compromises our work, how it hurts our people. The deputy director added another point to the board. Develop training materials based on real experiences. I have a condition, Wilson said, turning back to face the room. If we're going to use this morning's incident as a teaching tool, we need to protect the officer involved. He made a mistake, yes, but he's also shown genuine remorse and a willingness to learn. That's the kind of change we want to encourage. A knock on the door interrupted them again. The security officer himself stood there, looking nervous but determined. I heard you were discussing changes, he said. I'd like to be part of the solution, if you'll let me. The deputy director gestured for him to enter. That's exactly what we need. People willing to acknowledge mistakes and work towards real change. As the afternoon wore on, the meeting transformed from a crisis response into something more meaningful, a genuine effort to address deep-rooted issues. People shared stories they'd never told before, suggested changes they'd always thought impossible, and began to see their workplace through new eyes. Outside the conference room, the regular work of the FBI continued. Agents came and went, phones rang, cases were discussed. But something had shifted. In break rooms and hallways, at desks and in elevators, people were having conversations they'd avoided for years. The incident report, when it finally reached Washington that evening, wasn't just about what had happened at the side entrance that morning. It was about what happened afterward, how an ugly moment had sparked a movement for real change, how one agent's dignity had inspired others to speak up, and how an organization dedicated to justice had been forced to look at justice within its own walls. 2 weeks after the incident, the FBI field office's main training room was packed. Agents and staff members filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. The room buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't a routine training session. This was different. Agent Wilson stood at the front of the room, no longer in casual clothes, but in a crisp suit. Behind him, the security officer who had stopped him that morning sat quietly, hands folded in his lap. The contrast between this scene and their first encounter couldn't have been more striking. I'm not here to lecture you about bias, Wilson began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. We've all sat through those presentations before. Instead, I want to tell you a story about perspective. He clicked a button, and the screen behind him showed a split image. On one side, security footage from that morning 2 weeks ago, on the other, footage from one of his successful undercover operations. In this operation, he gestured to the right side of the screen. I used people's assumptions to my advantage. The criminal organization never suspected a federal agent because they saw what they expected to see. But that same thinking, he pointed to the left side, almost created a serious incident right here in our own building. The room was completely silent now, every eye fixed on the screen. The security officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but kept his gaze steady. The officer who stopped me that morning is here today, Wilson continued, turning to acknowledge him. He's not here as an example of what not to do. He's here because what happened that morning taught us all something valuable about ourselves. The officer stood up, straightening his uniform. His voice was clear but humble as he addressed his colleagues. 2 weeks ago, I made a decision based on unconscious bias. I saw a man in casual clothes approaching a restricted entrance, and instead of following standard procedure, I let my assumptions take over. He paused, looking around the room. I've been in law enforcement for 12 years. I thought I knew better. But that morning showed me how much I still had to learn. Wilson stepped forward again. The easy thing would have been to punish the officer, make an example of him, and move on. But that wouldn't solve the real problem. Instead, we're doing something more challenging. We're having honest conversations about bias, about assumptions, about the split-second decisions we make every day. He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from internal surveys conducted over the past 2 weeks. Since that morning, over 50 employees have come forward with similar experiences, not just in our office, but across the bureau. People who stayed quiet because they didn't think speaking up would make a difference. The deputy director, standing at the back of the room, nodded in acknowledgement. The changes sparked by that morning's incident had already begun rippling through the organization. But here's what gives me hope, Wilson continued, switching to a new slide showing the revised security protocols and training programs. We're not just talking about change, we're making it happen. The officer who stopped me that morning? He's now leading workshops on bias recognition for our security team. He's turning his mistake into a teaching tool. The officer stepped forward again. When I radio for backup now, I ask myself, am I doing this because of a real threat or because of my own assumptions? When I approach someone, am I treating them with the respect they deserve, regardless of how they look? Wilson turned to address the room directly. In our line of work, we're trained to be suspicious, to look for threats, to trust our instincts. But we also need to recognize when those instincts are clouded by bias. Because the next person you stop without cause might not be an FBI agent, they might be someone who needs our help, someone who's counting on us to be better than our prejudices. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. In those shadows, people shifted in their seats, some taking notes, others nodding in agreement, all of them part of a change that started with one morning encounter. I want to end with something personal, Wilson said, his voice softer now. The hardest part of that morning wasn't being stopped, or having a hand moved to a holster, or even being treated like a suspect. The hardest part was seeing my colleagues' faces as they watched it happen. Today, I'm asking all of you, don't be bystanders. When you see something wrong, speak up. Because change doesn't happen from the top down, it happens when each of us decides to be better. The room erupted in applause, not the polite kind that follows most presentations, but the genuine response to words that hit home. As people began to stand, many approached Wilson and the officer, sharing their own stories, asking questions, committing themselves to the change they wanted to see. 6 months later, the Philadelphia FBI field office looked the same from the outside, but inside, things had changed dramatically. The morning sun streamed through the windows as agents and staff arrived for work, but there was something different about how people greeted each other, how they moved through the building, how they interacted. Agent Wilson stood at the same side entrance where everything had started, this time holding the door open for a group of visiting law enforcement officials. They were here to learn about the changes that had transformed this office into a model for the entire bureau. It's hard to believe it all started right here, the security officer said, now wearing a new badge that identified him as the lead training coordinator for security personnel. He'd earned the position through his dedication to reforming security practices and his honest conversations about his own journey. The deputy director joined them, carrying a thick folder. "The latest numbers just came in," she said, opening the file. "Reports of bias incidents are down 70% across all our offices. But more importantly, reporting of potential issues has gone up. People aren't staying silent anymore." Inside the main conference room, photos lined the walls: training sessions, workshop groups, community outreach events. Each image told part of the story of how one difficult morning had sparked a movement that spread far beyond Philadelphia. "You know what makes me proudest?" Wilson asked, gesturing to the photos. "It's not just about preventing discrimination. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels valued, where questions get asked, assumptions get challenged, and people look out for each other." The security officer nodded, remembering his own transformation. "Last week, I had a new recruit ask me why we changed our protocols. I showed him the video of that morning, but instead of focusing on my mistake, we talked about the courage it takes to admit when you're wrong and the strength it takes to turn a negative experience into positive change." Through the window, they could see new recruits arriving for their morning briefing. The training they would receive today was very different from 6 months ago. Now, every session began with real stories, honest discussions, and practical strategies for recognizing and addressing bias. "The FBI director called yesterday," the deputy director shared, closing her folder. "He wants to implement our program nationwide. They're calling it the Philadelphia model, a comprehensive approach to building a more inclusive law enforcement culture." Wilson smiled, remembering all the late nights and tough conversations that had led to this moment. "You know what's funny? That morning, I thought I was just heading in for another day of undercover prep. Instead, we ended up uncovering something much more important." The security officer checked his watch. "Speaking of which, we have that joint training session with local law enforcement in 10 minutes. They're especially interested in hearing how we transformed our security protocols." As they walked to the training room, they passed the wall where the FBI seal hung. Someone had added a new plaque beneath it, engraved with words that had become the office's unofficial motto: "Change begins with courage, grows through understanding, and lives in our daily actions." The training room was already full when they arrived. Police officers, federal agents, security personnel, all there to learn from what had happened in this building. But more than that, they were there to be part of something bigger than themselves. Wilson took his place at the front of the room, standing beside the security officer who had once stopped him. Together, they had told this story dozens of times, but it never got old. Because every time they shared it, they saw the same thing happen: people beginning to understand that real change wasn't about rules or protocols. It was about having the courage to look at yourself honestly and the strength to do better. 6 months ago, Wilson began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Something happened at that side entrance that could have torn this office apart. Instead, it brought us together. And today, we're going to show you how you can make the same change in your departments. The security officer stepped forward. "We're not here to tell you we've solved everything. We're here to show you what's possible when people commit to real change. When they're willing to have uncomfortable conversations, challenge their own assumptions, and stand up for what's right." As the presentation began, phones around the room stayed silent. Nobody was checking emails or messages. Every person in that room knew they were part of something important. A change that started with one incident at a side entrance, but had grown into a movement that was reshaping law enforcement from the inside out. Outside, the city of Philadelphia went about its business, unaware that inside this federal building, a quiet revolution was spreading. A revolution built not on confrontation, but on understanding. Not on punishment, but on growth. Not on division, but on the simple idea that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. The morning sun had risen high now, erasing the shadows from that first difficult morning. In their place was something new: hope, understanding, and the promise of continued change.